Hey YouTube. This is an island over which I planned to document the building of an entire city series, but this style of building takes me too long and I have decided to chase my dream of vanilla-ish city building. There is a low to medium chance I will resurrect this though. Hopefully there comes a day when my videos don't begin with reference to abandonment of the exhibited project. The island was intended to encapsulate many different biomes that would encourage separation of urban areas even when in close proximity, including meadows, swamp, desert, and perhaps lesser defined sections, but which still encourage varied planning in my eyes, beach, sand spit, river, elevations, and sub-islands. As far as I managed in the way of city building was construction of the Wharf and Silo complex featuring a very painted intersection. Terraforming the island. I begin in Map Editor as initially I wanted the option of posting this on the workshop, however working with the network rivers assets which are used for the swamp biome was frustrating in said editor, so the map is postable in fetal form only. I'm emulating the Australian Alps because they look fairly shallow and should be easy to build over in this miniature form, which is a good excuse for the fact that I fail at making compelling precipices anyhow. I haven't done much detailed work with terrain and miniaturizing the scale leaves less flexibility for detail, so I was struggling here. This is how the mountain looked at first and I nearly rage quit, but after further adding jags I was more satisfied than I would have been starting again for the nth time. I also painted the desert to guide the edge of the emanating smaller mountain for extemporaneously appropriate miniature city buildability. I end up redoing the small hill, but I lost that footage, and by lost, I mean I never hit record. And by never hit record, I mean I hit record, but left the window capture unchecked. So here is 45 minutes of black screen. With the elevations adumbrating the ambit of the island, I start carving away land to create the coast. Another feature which disappoints me at first, but with which I contend on the basis that 1, I will probably make ameliorations when I build here, and 2, Seebs. Next I add the river, which to this day does not flow very well, an island, and the swamp. Take one of the swamp features an unbroken area of land covered in network rivers, although I later add a wider gap of water flowing through the middle. I am primarily copying $2.20 after seeing the swamp he made for his Marble Mountain series, making squiggles and widening them at various points. To my surprise, I most like the vanilla oil texture after trying many theme sources for the swampland. I tapered the sand coverage where the riverbed meets the seafloor, but was unsure what to do with the ledges or coastal elevations of land. I added definition by going over with this softening tool, mostly randomly, but I also tried to imagine the effect of water runoff. Work continues along the coast and I have the idea of adding a sand spit with sand surrounding small segments of broken land. Then I add some oomph to the small hill for greater discreteness, and so the dust bowl between the two elevations is more like a bowl and less like this wave-shaped dish dryer. At this point I try adding some foliage, creating clusters of large trees, live oaks and dawn redwoods, surrounded by small trees, white birch and based acacias. I like how cartoony and textured this looks, but on a large scale it was messy and overshadowed the landscape. I would likely employ this system for detailing when the terrain isn't predominantly woodland though. The swamp is bestowed with the gap of water I said I would add later being now, and I settle on a simple foliage pattern using mangrove trees and based acacias. Here I'm tempted to leave the rest of the island's sans flora, I just think it looks cool like this. By the way, you may have noticed I added another island up here as I was worried there was too little existing flat land to harbour a substantial city, and I think it rounds out the shape, making the area look more situated. I also extend the sand spit, adding more segments of broken land inspired by this place in Hawaii, and the seafloor, adding detail by creating bumps which I go over with the softening tool. The worst part of this whole terraforming process was realising that there was too little difference in elevation between the sandbanks and surrounding shallows. Tracing every sandy shoreline to correct this was tedious. Detailing is completed by settling on dense foliage around the river while leaving most of the terrain fairly sparse. The foliage isn't my favourite and I even succumbed to using tree brush, but overall I think the island looks bright and sparkly, ready for construction and greater detailing in future. Building the Wharf. I lay 2 adjacent elevated dirt roads using the default road over water height, as I find handy the ability to reference this constant when shifting things over uneven terrain. I like the wooden veneer/railings of the elevated dirt roads, and I like the idea of those old-timey brick pillars, although I'm on the fence. Okay, just going to copy the height here and... yep, Okay, thanks. Heaps good. Nah. Then I line up a bunch of conveyors and place them over the wharf, along with ploppable asphalt on which I paint lanes using yellow lines. The conveyor is covering the inner lane of each road segment, so only the outer lanes become lanes as such. The choice of line colour feels appropriate because this is an industrial area, although why I make that association I have no idea. More importantly, it fulfills my love of coloured road markings, as demonstrated by this previous build. I hope this series affords the opportunity for many coloured intersections with like blue stuff and green stuff there, and even some red stuff. Sweet. Then I position the slanted conveyors which connect to the bulk dry loaders, taking inspiration from Port Lincoln Wharf in South Australia. They grow seeds there or something. Now the position of docking ships has been determined beyond the sandbanks where the water is deeper. A wider section of asphalt is required to accommodate the loaders, which I like because it creates a mini industrial oasis. Then I extend the wharf to meet said oasis. I notice the conveyor supports look like crap protruding through the surface of the wharf and am forced to raise the conveyors. It looks lanky like this, but what can you do? Then I add roads to the oasis, required to be ground networks so the cargo dock can later be connected, over which I once again paint yellow lanes. I also realise the loaders require supporting pillars since the Great Conveyor Raising of 020. After connecting the new ground roads to the existing elevated wharf, I determine exactly where the wharf ends and the oasis begins by shifting the connections until the wharf fence terminates evenly on both sides, making way for the wider asphalt segment. Cue terraforming network, which flattens the terrain sticking to the ground roads. Concrete wall network is used to border the ground roads as they look glitchy, causing this section to look like reclaimed land and further cementing its status as an oasis. Okay. I shift the surfaces so they reach the edge of the walls while bridging the ground roads to create a U-turn. Then I paint the U-turn and fill in the gap between the wharf and oasis lanes, which don't perfectly follow the path traffic takes along these routes, but I can live with that. I realise the concrete walls aren't reaching the seafloor, so I position a lowered duplicate. Also, there is a little vacuous black hole in the earth under the ground to elevated connections, which I hide with ploppable pavement. You can't really tell it's not sand at this depth. Engage panic mode. I didn't account for the space required to place a dock area following from the roads under the loading side of the loaders, and the thought of resizing the concrete walls now is quit-worthy, but I just end up hiding them in the existing construction, which functions fine. Cease panic mode. Some finishing details. This swanky little shed at the end. Reposition pillars so there is one under every conveyor support. Duplicate terraforming network to widen coverage, hiding those unsightly jags. Change conveyor colour. For some reason the 75-degree segments will not change colour, so I swap them for the 45-degree segments. And finally some random industrial junk, crates etc.
Building the silo complex.
Moving to the land, I position several grain elevators to create a large silo building which I connect to a conveyor segment that is turned 90 degrees. I duplicate the silos to give the area more impact, and I want this infrastructure to have a lasting influence as farming will be a dominant industry for the island for some time to come. Following from the conveyor's end, I extend the wharf back and merge to a ground network, the beginning of a major road that will connect the wharf with the island's municipalities. I dub the Wharf Road. Then I surround the silos with dirt road. Changing their course, I lengthen the conveyors and position a parking lot. At the new conveyor's end, I place a couple overlapping factory holes intended to function as a quote-unquote processing shed. The idea being that silo matter destined for this facility would pass through the shed before proceeding along the conveyors to the silos and finally along the wharf to the loaders. In fact, I'm a hider warehouse inside the shed, so it functions as a dropping off point. Not that the conveyors will fulfill their function in turn, but anyhow. To complete the purely ornamental conveyors, I bridge the gap between the silos.
Building the intersection.
Now I go down a rabbit hole editing the car park / loading area and related intersection with Wharf Road. I usually start with somewhat of a draft, but foresaw this was going to be too involved to motivate a second rendition, which is why I instate permanence, i.e. start filming, after having already positioned the road barriers, arbitrarily red and white where decorative effect wins over the fact of this barrier type typically being used for temporary applications, the parking spaces, plus disabled parking spaces and truck loading bays manually drawn with yellow lines, this bypass lane made with the single lane Shuto Expressway as the narrow width gives a better indication of where traffic will situate. However, in hindsight I should have allowed for more space given the function of this lane is for cargo traffic bypassing the parking lot on its way to the loading bay, namely trucks, big ones, and the entry/exit points at each side of the lot. Oh, and this junk is just to temporarily create traffic for testing purposes. Moving on, I create a direct connection from the entry lane to the bypass lane, skipping the parking lot node as this allows traffic to follow a non-haphazard route. Then I used the vanilla oil industry fence to border the bypass lane and painted red with the Japanese slow lane decal, enclosed by white lines. The suitability of a cargo container lot, marked with cargo yard decals overlooked by carriers and filled with containers, here is questionable as the envisioned purpose of this facility is agricultural. Mind you, I can't forestall the cargo dock's proclivity to service other sectors, indeed I rely on it until I build a larger port in future. Anyhow, whatever the case, I deem this lot decorative industrial filler. On a more functional note, I blot out the truck bays taking up space through which service vehicles will access the hidden processing storage, marking the space with "Don't go there" stripes. I also tried out blue lines. A gap is made in the fence where the dirt silo access road intersects the bypass lane, and this segment's solid white line is replaced by a dotted one. Another dotted line marks the bypass lane entry, which is widened to give trucks an easier time. This section requires painting with red lines as the JP decals won't conform. Scattered throughout are Taiwan road markings, having no correspondence to their real-life denomination, except for the turn arrows. As these tend to stack beneath the JP decals, red lines underlay the applicable bypass lane section. I also had some no parking wear and procedural objects fitted Dutch signage, again bearing deviant meaning, especially in the context of taking place next to Taiwanese insignia. How about these Japanese signs? Intended for expressways, no less. Where are we exactly? Also, this cargo yard sign should be called into question as it is actually blocking the path of the container carrier. I like signs, okay? Same dealio as with the bypass lane entry, the exit is widened and red plus dotted lines employed. Connecting a road to nowhere contorts the exit segment so that traffic follows a desirable path, and the car park is neatened with asphalt and curbs, notably the immediate surrounds of the barrier where PO is useful. The elevation of curbs, as opposed to ploppable pavement, is nice, although overlapping segments can look messy. This made me realise I prefer ploppable pavement, but I also realised curbs are useful when working with PO, as converted segments can be safely copied, whereas converted pavement seems to glitch on the next load. Also, I extend the fence. The silos are branded by tessellating 4 steel frames and covering with vanilla billboards. I begin the Wharf Road intersection by upgrading to the asymmetrical 2+1 National Road. A contra lane follows from the parking lot adjacent to decorative bike lane. I add a road to nowhere which shapes the intersection so cars will stagger in accordance with the path taken by traffic turning from the vanilla bike lane road. The bounds of said path are determined by tracing the flow of traffic so I can correspondingly mould the contiguous lanes to come, i.e. the dotted bike lane, note how my life is ruined by the varied thickness, and contra lane crossing, required to remain a separate lane as it passes through so it can bypass the intersection node, as the joining segment was too short to obey a timed traffic light, which is fine with me as drawing the route manually enables traffic to follow a better path anyhow. Joke's on you, game. Consequently, a road to nowhere instates the stopping point, enabling a timed traffic light to be set up here, and the contra lane converges with the main flow of traffic at a further point. I join the parking lot exit lane, heading the opposite direction to Wharf Road, and to my frustration find that traffic insists on leaving a gap when queuing over the resulting intersection. I may fix this later if cars pile up, by keeping the lane separate so it can join the main traffic flow at a later point, as before. Then I duplicate the bike lane and, some missing footage here, decide the most intuitive way to mark the merge with the narrower road is to paint from the midline to the turn lane, paint the outer lanes parallel to that, and extrapolate those lines until they meet the outer edge of the bike lane, filling the gap of the inner bike lane edge with dotted lines. I use green lines to fill this section of the bike lane, which don't match the consolidated decals, but are homogenized by raising the height until they fade slightly. Also, I paint the turning lane, yellow with added arrows, and ascertain the wharf-bound stopping points by marking just in front of where cars stop. This bike lane merge turns out messy, but only up close, and like our old friend bypass lane, the contra lane is painted red. The yellow path markings are replaced by dotted white lines on one side, the other side being guided by the dotted bike lane. Not that it matters, as it is seemingly common for only the inner boundary of a turn to be marked. The contra lane crossing is coloured red before removing every second placement, completing denotation of a circuit between the wharf/cargo dock and processing shed/grain silo storage. The turn lane crossing is marked with dotted yellow lines, and so is the other side of Wharf Road, sans dotted. I had marked the Wharf entry in correspondence with a 2-lane road earlier, but decide to extend the 2+1 lane national road all the way back, as the lanes line up better and there is more room for traffic to go around this pole when exiting. However, traffic does not follow an aesthetic path around the pole, so I employ a separate lane to traverse this space. Then I paint the median with diagonals by overlapping many yellow lines. With some diagonals on the side of the road now as well, I start cutting through with a crosswalk, preceded by tactile paving on either side, and followed later by blue zones surrounded by PO edited curbs. These are inspired by school zones in Unley, South Australia, the purpose of which, I surmise, is to have pedestrians highlighted more or less on the road as an approaching hazard for traffic. The thing about marking these zones blue is they can only be as short as the blue line used itself, which can complicate placement and associated pathway shaping. A similar crossing is applied to the parking lot entry, and I mould the pedestrian zone to the curved linework by leaving one curb longer and with bare edges. Some diagonals for the other side, struggling with the changing angle but looks okay, and a road to nowhere is required to make cars stop behind the white line. The ploppable asphalt I neglected to address until now was just for the sake of helping me see what I'm doing, but now I neaten things up by making some permanent placements. It wouldn't even be necessary to asphalt most of Wharf Road, except that it is not recognised by road options. A path borders the road up to the Wharf entry where pedestrians can cross to an island. After that, I guess they just traverse asphalt if continuing along the wharf. No blue zone here due to the prior mentioned length issue. Here, have these consolatory chevrons. And while we're at it, why not some superfluous signage, painted on both the approaching and receding sides? Look at that pole utilisation. That's right, conserve your energy for displaying directions to the back of vehicles. The way this path briefly emerges from the asphalt looks out of place with nothing else around it, solved by containing the area to more fencing. I start adding another blue zone crossing over the parking lot exit lane, and the contra lane is divorced from the bike lane by curbs with little sign thingies. For some reason there is a dip in the curb remedied by white lines. I merge the dotted bike lane with the differing width vanilla lane, putting up with the result. Then I dot the passable side of the turning lane and neaten the national road merge using ploppable grass and gravel moulded with PO. I should have used surface painter here, but I doused the empty space with curbs. Then I dot the bike lane as the parking lot exit lane markings meet it, paving the space next to the processing shed as well. Adding another blue zone to the lot exit crossing median, pavement extends to fill in the asphalt gap, accompanied by racing stripes, the angles of which required much trial and error. A few final decals and signs, and some crates. I duplicate the dotted yellow line over the main intersection, as I figure this route has a considerable amount of interruptions from other route markings to contend with. It feels odd to have pedestrians walking around a supposed crate yard, so curbs are used to separate the path. Swanky, no? Finally, I place traffic lights, since replaced by these later released bad boys, and add the last stop line, looking a little wonky due to the change of elevation between roads. I try to attenuate this by staggering asphalt segments, but ugh. That's the intersection complete, just a quick explanation of the associated timed traffic light. First of all, the vanilla bike lane road has no wharf access, as the preceding area is planned to have little relevance to cargo or parking/processing access. The absence of routes from this road causing interruption to the contra lane saves idle time by consolidating all emanating traffic flow and contra lane traffic flow to a single step. When the contra lane goes, so does the vanilla bike road. Then Wharf Road through traffic, and Wharf-bound traffic continues as Wharf departing traffic gives way to the right turn. Then it starts again. Lastly, a note on the presence and functionality of footpaths. Pedestrians are forced to access the Wharf or vanilla bike lane road by the crossing nexus, even though potential for a path on the other side suggests a more direct route. As I siebes adding a crossing here, I plan to defy said potential to justify the diversion by having an industrial, or some such, area with fences snug to the road boundary.
Continuing the silo complex.
Righto. Back to construction-y things, the coastal dirt silo roads are surrounded by retaining walls and lowered parking lots. A closer to water platform for closer to water than the wharf is stuff. An empty paved area exceeds the parking surrounded by more concrete walls. Very empty. Let's just focus on getting the infrastructure in place and impose purpose when there is a population to warrant it. This end receives a distinct parking lot, a facility will utilise this someday, and access is linked by the vanilla bike lane road. Clearer objective down this end where PO angles the pavement to form a boat ramp. I have since discovered surface networks exist, may be useful. This end also breaks the monotony with markings and boats, plus boat cranes accompanied by dock bumpers and curbs, railing tracing the platform's edge. I think the vanilla stable fence suits the cutoff to this scrub kind of area. Tracing the edge of the silo platform requires sourcing of a new fence asset, as the ones I had available magnetised to the lower terrain. The parking lot roads below favourably remove the terrain associated with dirt roads, which otherwise protrude from the retaining wall. However, this causes an unsightly shadow to show through the road, removed by extending the pushback of terrain using terraforming network. The now overreaching effect is hidden by ploppable gravel. I notice this conveyor support hanging in the air and extend the silo platform to meet it. Swank. Dock ladders descend to small wading platforms, a simple extension of the pavement surrounded by walls, and stairs form a direct connection between the wharf and parking platform, using slightly raised concrete walls for railing. In the previous episode, I said I would probably stick to a minimal foliage pattern for detailing, although I am now faced with areas requiring smaller filling, at which I have a crack using generic trees, road trees, gunneras, and pine bushes. I have some idea of what will fill the gap contained by the vanilla bike road, but for now I neaten the jaggy terrain with slope profiles. That's all, thanks for watching and goodbye forever. As far as I managed in the way of city building was construction of the wharf silo. Damn it.